This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. Rain fell over the city like static, blurring the neon signs of Fifth and Carver into smears of red and gold. Inside the Sacred Heart Community Clinic, the fluorescent lights hummed steady and white, indifferent to the storm outside. Indifferent to the man standing dead still in the doorway, with blood soaking through his shirt sleeve. He didn't look like the kind of man who came here. The clinic served the forgotten, the uninsured, the undocumented, the elderly who couldn't afford the pharmacy 2 blocks over. Its walls were the colour of old milk, its chairs mismatched, donated by 3 different furniture stores that had gone out of business trying to be generous. The man in the doorway wore a black wool coat that cost more than the clinic's monthly rent, and his shoes, even scuffed, were Italian leather. "We're not open for another 20 minutes, said the receptionist, not looking up from her paperwork, too tired to notice the way the man's jaw was clenched, the way his eyes swept the room like he was cataloguing every exit. "I'll wait," he said. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man who rarely had to repeat himself. He sat in the corner, away from the window, his wounded arm tucked against his ribs beneath the coat. He'd told his men he needed air. He'd told them to circle the block twice and come back. He had not told them where he was going, because if they knew, they would have taken him somewhere else, somewhere with private doctors, who didn't ask questions, who filed nothing, who billed nothing, who forgot everything the moment cash changed hands. But he hadn't wanted that. Not tonight. Tonight, Salvatore Moretti wanted to disappear. At exactly 7:02, a young woman came through the back door in blue scrubs, hair pulled into a knot that was already coming loose, a coffee in one hand, and a stethoscope draped around her neck like a scarf she'd forgotten to take off. She moved like someone who had already been awake for hours, checking a clipboard, saying good morning to the receptionist, to the janitor mopping the entryway, to an elderly man asleep in a plastic chair who she gently woke with a hand on his shoulder and a murmured, "Mr. Alvarez, you're up. Let's get you seen first, okay?" Salvatore watched her the way he watched everything, carefully, from a distance, cataloguing weaknesses, searching for the con, because everyone had one. Every act of kindness, in his experience, had a price tag hidden somewhere beneath it, a favour owed, a debt collected later with interest. He had built an empire on that single, unshakable truth. Except she didn't ask Mr. Alvarez for anything. She didn't glance at a clock, didn't check if anyone was watching. She simply moved from person to person with the same unhurried attention, as if each one were the only patient in the building. "Sir?" She was in front of him now. Up close, her eyes were a warm brown, tired but alert, and there was a small ink stain on her wrist where a pen had leaked. "You're bleeding through your sleeve." "It's nothing." "It's not nothing. It's soaking your coat." She said it without alarm, the way someone comments on weather. "Come with me." He should have left. Every instinct honed over 20 years in this business told him to stand up, walk out, find one of the private doctors his family kept on retainer, men who didn't look too closely, who understood that some questions were worth more unasked. But something in the calm certainty of her voice made him rise and follow her down a narrow hallway that smelled of antiseptic and bad coffee. The exam room was small, one window painted shut, a poster on the wall about the symptoms of high blood pressure. She snapped on gloves and gestured to the table. "Coat off, then shirt." "Just the sleeve is fine." She looked at him then. Really looked for the first time, and something flickered behind her eyes. Not recognition, not fear, just a quiet, patient stubbornness. I can't treat what I can't see. If you want, I can find you a hospital that'll do it through fabric and hope. He almost smiled. Almost. It had been a long time since anyone spoke to him like that. Like his presence wasn't a threat to be managed. Like his money and his reputation, and the two men currently circling the block in a black Cadillac, meant absolutely nothing in this room. He removed the coat. The shirt beneath was ruined, blood dried dark along the seam where the bullet had grazed his bicep. A graze, nothing more. Courtesy of a rival family's overeager soldier who would not live to regret it. She cut the sleeve away with trauma shears, her fingers steady despite the seriousness of the wound, and cleaned it without asking a single question about how a man got a gunshot wound on a Tuesday morning. "Lucky," she said finally, threading a suture needle. "Half an inch over and we'd be having a very different conversation." "You don't seem surprised." "I don't get paid enough to be surprised." A small, wry smile. "I'm Grace, by the way. You'll want to know the name of the person about to stitch you up without much anesthesia because we're low on lidocaine this month." "Salvatore," he said, and then, a beat too late, the lie he'd prepared. "Sal. Just Sal." If she noticed the hesitation, she didn't show it. She worked in silence for a while, her brow furrowed in concentration, and Salvatore, a man who had sat across tables from senators and killers alike, who had learned to read every twitch of a liar's mouth, found himself unable to look away from her hands. "You're not from around here," she said eventually, not quite a question. "What makes you say that?" "Your shoes cost more than my rent, your coat's cashmere, and you flinched when I said hospital, like you'd rather bleed out in a parking lot than have your name on a chart somewhere." She tied off the last stitch, snipped the thread, and finally met his eyes. "I'm not going to ask. Whatever you're running from or running toward, it's not my business. I just fix what walks through that door." "That's a dangerous policy," he said quietly, not asking. "Maybe, but it's the only way I get to sleep at night." She peeled off her gloves, tossed them in the bin, and reached for a roll of gauze. "This clinic doesn't survive on people telling the truth. It survives on people needing help and getting it without a price tag attached. That's the whole point." He watched her bandage the wound with brisk efficiency, watched the way she hummed faintly under her breath, off-key, unaware she was doing it. Outside, through the painted-shut window, he could hear the rain easing, the city beginning to stir. Somewhere out there his men were waiting, his empire was waiting. A war was simmering that would require his full and undivided cruelty. But in this room, for 11 minutes, none of that had existed. "You should come back in 5 days," Grace said, writing something on a card. "Get that redressed. Make sure it's not infected. We're open Tuesday through Saturday, 7 to 3. He took the card. Sacred Heart Community Clinic. Her name and a phone extension scrawled beneath it in blue ink. "I might," he said. "You will," she said, with the confidence of someone who had learned through hundreds of patients exactly which ones came back and which ones vanished into the city and never returned. "People like you always think they're too important to need help, and then they need it anyway." He left without correcting her, without telling her that people like him didn't get seen by doctors who filed paperwork, that people like him solved their problems with money or violence, usually both, and that the last time someone had spoken to him with that kind of easy, unguarded honesty, it had been his mother, 23 years dead. Outside, the Cadillac idled at the curb. Dominic, his second, rolled down the window, scanning Salvatore's bandaged arm with a flicker of alarm quickly smoothed into professional calm. "Boss, you good?" "I'm fine." Salvatore slid into the back seat, glancing once more at the clinic's faded sign through the rain-streaked glass. "Find out who runs that place, the Sacred Heart Clinic. Everything, funding, staff, who owns the building." Dominic frowned. "Something wrong with it?" Salvatore didn't answer right away. He was thinking of a woman with an ink-stained wrist who hadn't once asked his name, hadn't once flinched at the blood, who had looked at a stranger with a bullet wound and seen, apparently, nothing more than someone who needed help. "No," he said finally. "Nothing's wrong with it. I want to make sure it stays that way." The car pulled into traffic, and Salvatore Moretti, a man who had ordered deaths with less thought than most men gave to ordering coffee, found himself already counting the days until Tuesday. The Moretti family occupied the top 4 floors of a building on the waterfront that had once been a shipping warehouse and was now, after considerable renovation and considerably more laundering, one of the most exclusive addresses in the city. Salvatore's penthouse sat above it all. Glass walls, black marble floors, a wraparound terrace that looked out over the harbour where his family's cargo ships came and went, carrying things far more valuable and far more illegal than their manifests claimed. He stood at the window that evening with a glass of Barolo untouched in his hand, staring down at the city lights, thinking about a clinic with painted-shut windows and a nurse who hummed off-key while she worked. It was, he knew, a foolish thing to be thinking about. He had a war brewing with the Castellano family over territory neither side could afford to lose gracefully. He had 3 shipments due in through the port within the week, each one requiring the kind of coordination that left no room for distraction. He had a meeting the following morning with the city councilman, who kept 2 sets of books and needed reminding, gently but firmly, of which set mattered more to his continued good health. And yet. "You wanted the file on the clinic," Dominic said, letting himself into the penthouse without knocking, a privilege earned over 15 years of loyalty that had cost him 2 fingers on his left hand and, Salvatore suspected, a good portion of whatever conscience he'd once had. He dropped a folder on the glass table. Sacred Heart Community Clinic, founded 11 years ago by a non-profit board, mostly funded by grants and private donations that have been drying up for the last 3 years. Current annual deficit, 62,000 and climbing. They're 2 months behind on the building lease. The landlord's patient for now, but that won't last. Salvatore didn't turn from the window. Staff? Skeleton crew. 2 nurses, a part-time doctor who volunteers Thursdays, and an office manager who's basically running the place on caffeine and prayer. The head nurse, Dominic checked his notes, though Salvatore suspected he already knew the name and was simply being careful about how he said it. Grace Whitfield, 29, no family in the city, parents passed, no siblings on record. She's been there 6 years, turned down 2 hospital positions with triple the salary to stay. Why? Dominic shrugged, a man for whom such questions had never once mattered in his own life. Doesn't say in the file. Some people just are what they are, I guess. Salvatore finally turned, and something in his expression made Dominic go still. the old instinct of a soldier reading his boss's mood before it became dangerous. I want the clinic's financial gap closed, anonymously. Set up a shell, a foundation, something clean, nothing that traces back to us. Monthly donation, enough to keep them running comfortably. Not so much it draws attention. Boss, Dominic said it carefully, the way he said most things that bordered on questioning Salvatore's judgment. Can I ask why? Salvatore looked back out at the harbour, at the ships that carried his family's fortune in and out of the dark. Because that place does something none of us do anymore, he said quietly. It gives without taking. I want it to keep existing. Dominic didn't press further. In 15 years he had learned which of Salvatore's silences meant the conversation was over, and this was one of them. He left the folder on the table and let himself out, and Salvatore sat alone with his wine going warm in his hand, thinking about the way Grace Whitfield's hands had not shaken once while she sewed a bullet wound shut on a stranger who could have been anyone, a criminal, a corpse waiting to happen, a man who had, in fact, ordered the death of 2 people that very week. She hadn't asked. That was the thing that stayed with him. In his world, everyone asked. Everyone wanted to know what you could do for them, what leverage your need created, what debt your vulnerability might one day be called in to repay. Grace Whitfield had looked at his blood and seen only a wound. He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself, as he finished the wine and finally set the glass down, that a man in his position could not afford obsessions, that the Castellanos would not wait politely while he indulged some misplaced fascination with a nurse from the wrong side of the river. He told himself several things that night, lying awake long after the city outside had gone quiet, and none of them were entirely true. 5 days later, true to Grace's prediction, Salvatore returned to the Sacred Heart Clinic. He came in the same black coat, though this time without blood soaking through the sleeve, and the receptionist, who remembered him, or remembered the coat, or simply remembered that he did not belong, waved him toward the back without much ceremony. Grace was crouched beside a little girl no older than 6, examining a rash along her arm with the kind of patient gentleness that made the child giggle instead of cry. "Does it itch when you scratch it, or does it itch more after?" Grace was asking, and the girl said, "After," very seriously, as if this were an important scientific distinction, and Grace nodded like it was. Salvatore stood in the doorway and watched unnoticed for nearly a full minute before Grace glanced up and saw him. Something crossed her face, surprise, and beneath it something warmer that she quickly smoothed into professional neutrality. "Sal, you're early, and on time, which for a patient of mine is basically a miracle." "I wanted to make sure the arm was healing correctly." "Uh-huh." She finished with the little girl, sent her off with her mother and a lollipop from a jar that had definitely been purchased with someone's own money rather than clinic funds, and gestured Salvatore toward the same exam room. "Sit. Let's see the damage." He removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeve. The wound had closed cleanly, the stitches doing their work, the skin around it pink but not angry. Grace examined it with careful fingers, and Salvatore found himself far more aware of the warmth of her touch than any pain in his arm. "This is healing well," she said. "Better than I expected, honestly, for someone who probably didn't rest it the way I told him to. I had things to attend to." Things that involve more bleeding, I'm guessing. She said it lightly, but there was a question folded inside it, one she still had no intention of pushing. Sometimes, he admitted, and watched her expression flicker. Not fear, but a kind of careful recalibration, as if she were quietly filing away information about him that she had decided, for now, not to act on. "You know," she said, snipping the last stitch free with quick, sure movements, "most people who come through that door with your kind of injury don't come back for the follow-up. They disappear the second the bleeding stops. You came back." "I told you I might." "You did." She looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the small room filled with the hum of the ancient air-conditioning unit and the distant sound of a baby crying somewhere down the hall. Why? It was a simple question. Salvatore had spent his entire adult life avoiding simple questions, because they were always, in his world, traps disguised as small talk. But there was nothing calculating in the way she asked it, just genuine curiosity, unguarded, the same quality that had first caught his attention 5 days ago. "Because," he said slowly, choosing the truth for what felt like the first time in years, "you were the first person in a very long time who looked at me and didn't want anything." Grace held his gaze a moment longer than professional distance strictly required. Then she cleared her throat, taped a fresh bandage over the healed wound, and stepped back. "Well, that's a low bar most people clear without trying." "Not in my experience." "Then you've been keeping bad company, Sal." She smiled, and it transformed her whole face, made the tiredness around her eyes soften into something almost luminous. "You're free to go. Try not to get shot again before your next checkup." He stood, rolled his sleeve down, and lingered a moment longer than necessary at the door. "Dinner," he said. "Would you have dinner with me?" The question surprised even him. Too direct, too fast, everything his careful, calculating nature usually forbade. Grace blinked, clearly caught off guard, and for a moment he thought she would refuse, would recognize the danger in him that everyone else in his life recognized instantly, the danger she had somehow, impossibly, not yet seen. "I don't really date men whose last names I don't know," she said finally, not quite a no. "Moretti," he said. "Salvatore Moretti." Something shifted behind her eyes, the smallest flicker of recognition gone almost before he could name it. The Moretti name carried weight in certain circles of this city, weight that even a nurse working double shifts at a charity clinic might have heard whispered somewhere, in a headline, in a rumour passed between patients who'd once run in rougher circles than hers. But she didn't ask. She didn't run. "Grace Whitfield," she said instead, extending a hand as though they were meeting for the very first time. "And I get off at 7, if you're serious." "I'm always serious," Salvatore said, and shook her hand, and felt something in his chest shift that he had no name for, and no intention, yet, of examining too closely. He took her to a restaurant with no sign on the door, tucked into a converted brownstone 3 blocks from the harbour, the kind of place that didn't take reservations because it didn't need to. You simply knew someone, or you didn't get in at all. Salvatore always got in. Grace arrived in the same clothes she'd worn at the clinic, having had no time to change, apologizing for it the moment she slid into the booth across from him. "I hope you're not the type who needs a woman in heels to enjoy his dinner." "I'm the type who ordered you a coat, because it's supposed to drop below freezing tonight, and you left the clinic without one." He nodded toward the seat beside her, where a charcoal wool coat lay folded, tags still attached. Grace stared at it, then at him. "You bought me a coat?" "In the 20 minutes between me saying yes and you picking me up. I have people for that." "Of course you do." She didn't touch the coat, though he noticed her gaze return to it more than once throughout the meal, something complicated moving behind her expression, appreciation warring with wariness. "Do you always move this fast?" "No," he said, and it was, again, the truth. "I don't move at all, usually. I wait. I watch. I let other people make the mistakes of acting too quickly." He turned his wine glass slowly by its stem, watching the candlelight catch the deep red of it. "You're the exception." That's either the most romantic or the most alarming thing anyone's said to me in years, and I genuinely cannot decide which. Can it be both? Grace laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and the sound did something to him that no threat, no rival family, no gun pointed in his direction had ever managed. It cracked something open. They talked through dinner, not about his business, which he steered around with practiced ease, but about her, about growing up in a small town 2 hours upstate, about a mother who died of a treatable cancer because the family couldn't afford the treatment in time, about how that single fact had shaped every decision Grace had made since, every hospital shift she'd worked, every night she'd chosen the clinic over sleep, about the 2 job offers she'd turned down, one from a hospital across town paying triple, one from a private practice that would have let her work 9 to 5 with weekends off, because somewhere in this city there were 100 families just like hers had been, and somebody had to be the one who didn't ask for money before they helped. Salvatore listened the way he listened to almost nothing else in his life, completely, without calculation, without cataloguing the information for later use. He simply wanted to know her. "Your turn," Grace said finally, pushing her empty plate aside. "Tell me something real about you, Salvatore Moretti. Not the coat, not the restaurant with no sign, not whatever business lets a man walk into a free clinic in shoes that cost more than my car. Something real." He considered lying. It would have been easy. He'd built a lifetime of easy lies, smooth and practiced, deployed without a flicker of hesitation. But something about the candlelight, about the way she was looking at him like she actually wanted the answer and not the performance, made him choose otherwise. "My father built an empire out of fear," he said quietly. "He taught me that love was a weakness men in our family couldn't afford." He was right for a long time. I've spent 20 years making sure nothing and no one had the power to hurt me. Because the moment something does, everyone around you knows exactly where to aim. That sounds lonely. It is. He met her eyes. It was, until 5 days ago. Grace went very still. Outside, the city moved past the windows in streaks of light and shadow, and somewhere across town, Salvatore knew Dominic was handling a dispute with the Castellanos that would likely end in someone's blood on someone's floor. And here he sat, telling a nurse from a free clinic more truth than he had told anyone in a decade. "I don't know what you do," Grace said slowly. "I have a guess. I'm not stupid, Salvatore. I've treated enough gunshot wounds and enough men who flinch at hospitals to have a guess. But I don't know for certain, and some part of me doesn't want to. Because I like who you were in that exam room. I like the man who came back for his follow-up and told me the truth about loneliness instead of feeding me a line. And if the guess is right? She was quiet for a long moment, turning her water glass slowly, the same nervous habit he'd noticed in himself with the wine. Then I hope, she said finally, that whoever that man is, he's not the only thing you are. It should have been a warning. Salvatore had built his entire life around reading warnings correctly and reading them fast. The flicker of a man's eyes before he reached for a weapon, the pause in a negotiation before betrayal, the specific quality of silence that meant a room had turned dangerous. He read this one clearly too. She was giving him a door, an exit, a chance to be something other than what he was, if he wanted it badly enough. He had never wanted anything that badly in his life. "I'll walk you home," he said, instead of answering, because it was, he realized, the only honest response he had, not a promise, not a lie, but an offer of presence, the only currency he trusted himself to spend. They walked 6 blocks through the cold, Grace finally relenting and pulling on the coat he'd bought her. And when they reached the modest walk-up where she rented a 3rd-floor apartment, she turned to him on the stoop, with her breath fogging in the streetlight. This was, she searched for the word, not what I expected when I stitched up a stranger's arm on a Tuesday morning. Good or bad? I haven't decided yet. She smiled, small and real. Come back Thursday for your final checkup, and Salvatore. She paused at her door, key in hand. Whatever you are during the day, whatever business keeps you in shoes I can't afford and coats you buy on 20 minutes' notice. I'd like to keep meeting the man from tonight, if he's willing to keep showing up. She disappeared inside before he could answer, and Salvatore stood on the empty street for a long moment, watching the light flick on in a 3rd-floor window, feeling something in his chest that he hadn't felt in over 2 decades, and did not, if he was honest with himself, entirely know how to survive. His phone buzzed. Dominic. Castellano's men hit the Prescott shipment. 2 of ours dead. Need you at the warehouse. Salvatore looked once more at the lit window above him, then turned and walked back into the dark, already reassembling the armor he'd spent the last 3 hours quietly setting down. The Prescott Street warehouse smelled of salt water and gun smoke when Salvatore arrived. The kind of smell that had once meant nothing to him, and now, disorienting as it was, made him think of antiseptic and clean gauze and a woman who hummed off-key while she worked. He shook the thought off before he crossed the threshold. There was no room here for softness. 2 of his men lay under sheets near the loading dock, and a 3rd, Enzo, sat against a stack of crates with a bloodied cloth pressed to his side, alive but barely, cursing steadily in a mixture of English and Sicilian, while one of the crew tried to stem the bleeding. "Get him to Dr. Renzo," Salvatore said, crouching beside Enzo, his voice iron calm despite the fury coiling tight in his chest. "Now. Not the hospital." "Boss." Enzo grabbed his sleeve, blood-slicked fingers leaving a dark print on the fabric. "It was Castellano's crew. Marco led it himself. They knew our schedule." Someone talked. Salvatore's jaw tightened. A leak. That was worse than an attack. An attack he could answer with force, but a leak meant someone inside his own organization had sold information, had put a price on the lives of men who'd sworn loyalty to the Moretti name. Dominic. Salvatore rose, his voice dropping into the register his men had learned over the years to fear more than any shout. I want to know who had access to the Prescott schedule, all of it, dock workers, drivers, anyone who touched that manifest in the last week. Already on it. Dominic's face was grim in the dock lights, blood, not his own, staining his shirt collar where he'd helped carry the wounded. Boss, this is the third hit this month. Castellano's getting bolder. If we don't answer hard, he reads it as weakness. Salvatore looked out at the black water beyond the dock, at the container ships lit up like small cities against the night. 20 years ago, his father would have burned Marco Castellano's entire operation to the ground without a second thought, would have made an example so brutal it silenced every whisper of rebellion for a decade. Salvatore had learned that lesson well. He had built his reputation on precisely that kind of controlled, surgical brutality. "Find the leak first," he said finally. "Then we answer Castellano. I want this done clean, not a street war that draws police and headlines. Something quiet, something that makes the message clear without making the 6 o'clock news." "And if the leak's someone we trust?" Salvatore's expression didn't change, though something behind his eyes went colder, harder, the version of himself he kept carefully separated from the man who'd sat across a candlelit table 3 hours earlier, telling a nurse about loneliness. Then trust was always going to cost someone their life, eventually. Find them. He left the warehouse 2 hours later, blood not his own on his cuffs, the image of 2 dead men under white sheets seared into a mind that rarely allowed itself to linger on such things. He should have gone home. Instead, without quite deciding to, he found himself directing his driver toward the narrow street where Grace's apartment sat dark, except for that same third-floor window, now unlit, the whole building asleep. He didn't get out of the car. He simply sat, watching the dark window, thinking about the particular danger of what he was doing. Not the danger to himself, which he'd stopped fearing decades ago, but the danger to her. Every enemy he had, and he had many, would see a woman like Grace not as a person, but as leverage, a soft place to press a blade, to force his hand. His father had taught him that lesson too, in blood, when Salvatore was 19 and his mother had paid for his father's enemies, knowing exactly where to aim. I'm the type who waits, who watches, who lets other people make the mistake of acting too quickly. He had told her that at dinner, believing it fully. Sitting outside her building at 2 a.m. with someone else's blood on his shirt, he understood with the same cold clarity he applied to every other calculation in his life, that where Grace Whitfield was concerned, he had already acted too quickly, and there was no version of pulling back that would undo it now. "Boss," Dominic's voice from the front seat, careful. "You want me to take you home?" Salvatore looked once more at the dark window. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Take me home." But even as the car pulled away, he was already making calculations he hadn't made in years. How to keep 2 lives from colliding. How to be both the man who funded a leaking clinic in a shell company's name and the man who would, within days, answer a rival family's aggression with violence precise enough to make Marco Castellano regret ever hearing the Moretti name. How to protect a woman who didn't yet know she needed protecting from a war she didn't know existed, waged by a man she'd only ever met as Sal, a stranger with a bullet wound and an easy lie about his own name. He thought of her laugh at dinner, unguarded and real. He thought of the two dead men under white sheets at the warehouse, and the leak still unaccounted for within his own ranks. Two worlds, and he was standing directly between them, holding the door to both. Thursday came, grey and drizzling, the clinic's small waiting room fuller than usual, flu season creeping in early, a line of coughing patients and cranky toddlers stretching nearly to the door. Grace hadn't sat down in 4 hours when Salvatore walked in, and she almost missed him entirely amid the chaos, catching sight of the black coat only when he'd already taken a seat in the corner, patient, unbothered by the wait, watching her work the room with the same fascination he'd worn on his first visit. "You picked a bad day," she told him breathlessly when she finally got him into the exam room nearly 40 minutes past his scheduled time. "I'm sorry. It's been a nightmare in here since 7. "I don't mind waiting. Most people mind waiting." She checked his arm, fully healed now, barely a scar visible, nothing left to justify a medical visit at all, and they both knew it. "This looks great. You really don't need to come back for this anymore." "I know." Something in the way he said it made her look up from his arm and meet his eyes, and the air in the small room shifted, charged with everything neither of them had said since the stoop outside her apartment 3 nights ago. "Then why are you here, Salvatore?" "Because I wanted to see you." No pretense left, no excuse dressed up as medical necessity. "And because I have something to ask you, and I didn't want to ask it over the phone." Grace set down her clipboard slowly. "Okay." "I know the clinic's struggling, behind on the lease, running a deficit that gets worse every quarter." He watched her expression flicker with surprise, quickly masked. "I'd like to help, properly, not anonymously through a shell company." A small, wry admission that made her eyebrows shoot up. "But openly, as myself, if you'll let me." "Wait," Grace held up a hand. "Shell company? What shell company?" Salvatore hesitated, the first genuine hesitation she'd seen from him, a crack in the composure he wore like a second skin. "The Ferrante Foundation. It's been covering your operating deficit for the last 2 weeks. It's mine." Grace sat down heavily in the room's single spare chair, staring at him. Salvatore, that's $40,000. The board's been talking about it all week, trying to figure out who our mystery donor is, whether it's a mistake, whether we need to give it back." "Don't give it back." "I wasn't planning to," she said, a little dazed. Why? Why would you do that anonymously, and then tell me now, like this?" He considered the question with the same careful weight he gave every decision in his life, and then, again, chose honesty over the easier lie. "Because I wanted this place to survive, whether or not you and I ever spoke again. And because now that we have spoken again, I don't want there to be a lie sitting between us, not even a small one, not even a generous one." Grace was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between wonder and wariness, the same combination he'd seen flicker across her face at dinner when he'd told her about his father. "You still haven't told me what you do," she said finally. "Not really." "I looked you up, Salvatore. After dinner, I couldn't help it." His whole body went still. And I found news articles. Federal investigations that never led anywhere. A name that comes up in connection with 3 different unsolved cases involving the docks. A family that half this city is afraid to say out loud in public. She held his gaze, steady, despite the tremor he could hear underneath her voice. I found enough to know that the guess I made at dinner wasn't wrong. The room went very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a child laughed at something, oblivious to the weight settling over the small exam room like a held breath. "I'm not going to lie to you," Salvatore said finally. "Not about this. I run an organization that operates outside the law. I've done things, ordered things, that would horrify you if you knew the details. And I won't pretend otherwise to keep you comfortable. I built my life on the assumption that no one who truly knew me could ever stand to stay close to me. And for 20 years, I made peace with that. I didn't need anyone to stay. And now? Now I sat in a waiting room full of screaming children for 40 minutes because I wanted 5 more minutes with a woman who stitched up my arm and asked for nothing in return." He said it simply, without artifice, and it landed harder for its plainness than any grand declaration could have. "I don't know how to reconcile the 2 halves of what I am, Grace. I only know that when I'm with you, I want to be the half that deserves to be." Grace didn't answer right away. She stood, crossed to the small window, looked out at the grey drizzle falling over the parking lot, where a line of patients still waited under a bus shelter for the clinic to reopen its doors. "My mother died," she said quietly, not turning around, because the people who could have saved her decided her life wasn't worth the cost of the treatment. "I've spent my whole career trying to be the opposite of that kind of calculation. The kind where a person's worth gets measured against a price tag. And now you're standing here telling me you measure worth in bodies and silence and men who disappear off the docks, and some part of me should be running out of this room right now. But you're not." She turned back to him, eyes bright, and there was no easy answer in her expression. No simple resolution to the storm he could see moving behind her eyes. "No," she admitted. "I'm not. And I don't fully understand why, except that the man who sat in my waiting room for 40 minutes doesn't feel like a lie, Salvatore. He feels like the truest thing I've met in years. I just don't know if that's wisdom or a very expensive mistake." "Maybe both," Salvatore said, echoing her own words back to her from dinner. And for the first time that day, Grace laughed. Small, surprised out of her despite everything, the sound cutting through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. "Get out of my exam room, Salvatore Moretti," she said, still half laughing, wiping at her eyes. "I have 40 more patients to see, and you're distracting me in ways that are extremely unprofessional." He rose, buttoned his coat, and paused at the door. "Dinner again? Saturday, when the clinic's closed and you're not running on 4 hours of sleep?" Grace hesitated only a moment. "Saturday," she agreed. "But Salvatore, if you're going to keep showing up in my life, I need you to actually show up. All of it. Not just the parts you think I can handle." "All of it," he promised, and meant it more fully than he had meant almost anything in 20 years, not yet understanding the full weight of what that promise would eventually cost them both. Saturday's dinner became a habit, and the habit became something neither of them named out loud, but both understood completely. 3 weeks slid by, in a rhythm Salvatore hadn't known his life could hold. Mornings spent in boardrooms, disguised as legitimate shipping offices. Afternoons spent managing a war with the Castellanos that simmered just below open violence. And evenings, when he could steal them, spent with Grace. He learned the small things first. That she took her coffee black and complained about it the entire time. That she cried at the ending of nature documentaries, but never at movies designed to make people cry. That she kept a photograph of her mother in her wallet, worn soft at the edges from being touched too many times. That she was, beneath the competent, unshakable calm she wore at the clinic, quietly, fiercely lonely. Had been since her mother's death, since she'd built a life around giving to others that left very little room for anyone to give back to her. He gave back, carefully at first, and then without restraint. Small gifts she initially refused and eventually, reluctantly, accepted. Quiet hours spent simply sitting with her on her small apartment balcony, while she talked about her patients, her worries, the parts of her day too small to matter to anyone else, but that he found himself hungry to hear anyway. He did not tell her about the 2 men who had died on the Prescott docks. He did not tell her about the leak they'd finally identified, a driver named Petrosky who'd sold the shipment schedule to Castellano's crew for $11,000, whose fate Salvatore had insured with the same cold efficiency his father had taught him, and who would not be found by anyone looking. He kept that world carefully, deliberately separate, telling himself it was protection, not deception, that the woman deserved a version of him that didn't carry the doc's blood on its hands into her small, warm apartment. It was Dominic who first voiced the danger out loud. "Boss, you've been distracted." They sat in Salvatore's office 3 floors below the penthouse, the wall of monitors behind Dominic's desk cycling through footage of the docks, the warehouses, the nightclub that served as the family's most visible legitimate business. Castellano's men have been asking around about the clinic, about a nurse. Salvatore's entire body went cold and still. "Say that again?" "Words out, boss. Not officially, not confirmed, but Castellano's people have eyes on the east side, same as ours. Someone saw you at that clinic more than once, saw you at a restaurant with a woman who works there. It's starting to travel." Dominic's expression was carefully neutral, the tone of a man delivering news he knew would not be well received. "You know how this works. The moment Marco Castellano hears there's a woman you care about, that becomes the single most useful piece of information he owns." Salvatore stood, crossed to the window, looked out at the docks where 2 of his men had died weeks earlier. "I want security on her. Discreet. She can't know, not yet. It would frighten her and ask questions I'm not ready to answer. Rotating shifts, someone on her building at all times, someone tracking her route to and from the clinic." "That's a lot of resources for a woman who doesn't know she's mine to protect," Dominic said carefully. "She's not mine," Salvatore said, too sharply, and both men heard the lie in it even as it left his mouth. He exhaled, pressed a hand briefly against his eyes, an unguarded gesture Dominic had rarely seen from him in 15 years of service. "Just do it, Dom, please." Dominic nodded once and left without further argument, recognizing, as he always did, when his boss had reached the edge of what he could bear to discuss. Alone, Salvatore sat with the weight of what Dominic had told him settling over his chest like a stone. He had known, distantly, abstractly, that a relationship with Grace carried risk. Every relationship in his life carried risk. That was simply the tax levied on men who lived the way he lived. But knowing it in the abstract, and hearing that Marco Castellano's men were already circling, already gathering the pieces of a weapon they could one day aim directly at her, transformed the danger from theoretical to immediate. He thought of pulling back, of ending it cleanly, before it went any further, before the danger surrounding him could reach out and touch the one part of his life that remained, impossibly, still clean. He turned the thought over for the better part of an hour and found, in the end, that he could not make himself want it. He was already too far gone. He had been, he suspected, from the moment she'd looked at his bleeding arm and asked no questions at all. His phone buzzed. A text from Grace. Long day. Mrs. Alvarez's grandson got his cast off today. First time walking without a limp in 6 weeks. Some days this job is actually worth it. How's your day, mystery man? He looked at the message for a long moment, thinking of dead men under white sheets, of a driver named Petrosky who would never surface again, of Marco Castellano's soldiers watching a clinic on the east side with new and dangerous interest. Better now, he typed back. Dinner tomorrow? Always, she replied, and he set the phone down and allowed himself, for one unguarded moment, to simply feel something like happiness before the machinery of his other life reasserted itself and pulled him back toward the war waiting outside his window. Councilman Harold Whitmore's office occupied a corner suite on the 14th floor of City Hall, the kind of view that made a man feel important even when his actual power, measured honestly, was a fraction of what he liked to pretend. He was sweating slightly when Salvatore's car pulled up outside. Not from the heat, since October had turned properly cold, but from the particular kind of anxiety that came from owing men like Salvatore Moretti money they were not, at present, in any position to repay. Salvatore. Whitmore rose too quickly from behind his desk, hand extended, smile too wide. I wasn't expecting you today. I know. Salvatore didn't take the offered hand, simply settled into the chair across from the desk with the unhurried patience of a man who owned, in every meaningful sense, the ground beneath the councilman's expensive shoes. I'm here about zoning. Whitmore's smile flickered. Zoning? East Side redevelopment, specifically a parcel on Carver Street that includes a building currently leased to the Sacred Heart Community Clinic. Salvatore watched the colour drain slowly from the councilman's face. I understand there's a proposal moving through committee to reclassify that block for a mixed-use development. Luxury condominiums, I believe, backed by Halloran Development. That's... Salvatore, that's just a proposal. It's not... I also understand, Salvatore continued, as though the man hadn't spoken, that Halloran Development has made certain campaign contributions to your last 2 elections, and that you've been quietly courting their support for a state senate run next year, which means you have a very personal interest in seeing that clinic's building cleared for redevelopment, regardless of what happens to the people who currently depend on it. Whitmore sat down heavily, all pretense of composure gone. I don't know what you think you know. I know everything, Harold. That's rather the point of our arrangement, isn't it? You keep 2 sets of books for campaign contributions, and I make sure the ones that matter never see daylight, and in exchange you occasionally do me small courtesies. Zoning variances. A blind eye towards certain permits at the docks. Nothing that would trouble your conscience, if you still have one. Salvatore leaned forward slightly. This is one of those courtesies. The Carver Street Clinic does not get rezoned. Not this quarter, not next year, not ever, as long as I have any say in the matter. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. Whitmore's voice cracked slightly. Halloran's already put down deposits with 3 contractors. If I kill this now, after encouraging it for months— That sounds like a problem for you to solve, Salvatore said coolly, using whatever creativity got you elected in the first place. I don't particularly care how you manage Halloran's disappointment. I care that the clinic stays exactly where it is. Whitmore stared at him for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his frightened eyes. The particular desperation of a man realizing he was caught between 2 forces he could not afford to disappoint. Can I ask why? You've never cared about zoning on the East Side before, never cared about that clinic at all, as far as I've ever known. Salvatore rose, buttoning his coat, his expression giving away nothing. You don't need to understand my reasons, Harold. You need to understand the consequences of ignoring my instruction. I trust I've been sufficiently clear. He left the councilman's office without waiting for a response, descending 14 floors in silence, already turning over the conversation in his mind with the same careful precision he applied to every threat in his life. Halloran Development. He'd heard the name before, in passing, a mid-tier real estate firm with ambitions larger than its actual influence, the kind of company that made up for lack of legitimate power by cultivating exactly the sort of corrupt relationships Whitmore represented. It was, on the surface, a small thing. A councilman leaned on, a zoning proposal quietly killed before it ever reached a public vote. The kind of transaction Salvatore had executed 100 times in his career without a second thought. But as he settled into the back of his car and watched City Hall recede in the rearview mirror, he found himself troubled by something he couldn't quite name, an instinct honed over 20 years of reading danger before it fully arrived, that Halloran Development would not simply accept defeat and walk away. Men who invested deposits with 3 contractors did not give up quietly, and Whitmore, weak and frightened as he was, represented only the visible edge of whatever larger scheme was moving beneath the surface of Carver Street's future. He thought of Grace, of the clinic's cheerful, threadbare waiting room, of a little girl with a rash and a grandmother who'd finally walked without a limp. He had assumed, funding the clinic anonymously and now more openly, that money alone could solve whatever crisis eventually arose. He was beginning to understand, with the same cold clarity that had built his empire, that this particular threat might require more than money to defeat. It might require the very worst parts of him, the parts he had spent 3 weeks carefully keeping hidden from the one person whose good opinion had somehow become the thing he valued most in the world. The nightclub occupied the ground floor of a building Salvatore's family had owned for 2 decades, Velvet, the kind of place where the city's wealthy came to be seen, and the city's dangerous came to conduct business behind a curtain of bass-heavy music and expensive liquor. Salvatore rarely enjoyed it anymore, though he maintained appearances there twice a month, a ritual as much about visibility as pleasure. He hadn't planned to bring Grace. It was, in fact, precisely the kind of place he'd hoped to keep separate from her entirely. Too public, too entangled with the machinery of his business, too likely to expose her to exactly the kind of attention Dominic had warned him about. But she'd asked, lightly, over dinner the previous week, whether the notorious Salvatore Moretti actually owned a nightclub, or if that was just another rumour. and something in her teasing curiosity had made him want, badly, to show her this piece of his life too, to let her see all of it as he'd promised. She wore a deep green dress that made her look entirely unlike the woman in scrubs he'd first met, and Salvatore found himself, for a dangerous moment, unable to focus on anything else in the crowded room. "This is—" Grace looked around at the velvet booths, the crystal chandeliers, the crowd of beautiful, expensively dressed people moving through the space like they owned it. "Not what I expected." Disappointed? Terrified, actually. I'm fairly sure my dress cost less than the ice in these drinks. He laughed, an actual laugh, rare enough that the bartender within earshot glanced over in visible surprise and guided her toward a private booth in the back, away from the worst of the noise. They'd barely settled in before a voice cut through the music, smooth and performatively warm in a way that made every muscle in Salvatore's body go rigid. "Salvatore Moretti. I heard rumors you'd finally settled down, but I didn't believe it until now." Marco Castellano stood at the edge of the booth, flanked by two of his men, a glass of scotch in one hand, and a smile that never reached his eyes. He was handsome in the way certain dangerous men were handsome, sharp-featured, expensively dressed, radiating the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no and taken it seriously. "Marco." Salvatore's voice was flat, controlled, giving away nothing of the alarm now roaring through his chest. "This isn't the time." "On the contrary, I think it's exactly the time." Marco's eyes moved to Grace, slow and assessing, and Salvatore felt something violent and possessive coil tight in his chest at the way the other man looked at her, like she was information, like she was a piece to be studied and later used. "And who is this? Salvatore's never introduced me to anyone before. I'm almost hurt." "Grace," she said, extending a hand with the same unguarded confidence she showed every patient at the clinic, apparently oblivious to the danger radiating off both men. "And you are?" "Marco Castellano." He took her hand, held it a beat too long. "A business associate of Salvatore's. Though associate might be generous, competitor's more accurate, isn't it, Sal?" "Leave," Salvatore said, and his voice had dropped into a register Grace had never heard from him before, cold and absolutely without mercy, the voice of the man Dominic and every soldier in his organization feared. "Now, Marco." Marco's smile widened, unbothered, clearly enjoying whatever reaction he was provoking. "Touchy. I only wanted to say hello." He turned back to Grace with exaggerated courtesy. "You should be careful, sweetheart, keeping company with a man like Salvatore. His attention has a way of becoming very expensive for the people around him. Ask his last associate." "Oh, wait." A cold, theatrical pause. "You can't. He's not really available for questions anymore." The threat landed exactly as intended, and Salvatore rose from the booth with a speed that made two of Marco's men instinctively reach toward their jackets. "You have exactly 5 seconds to walk away from this table, Marco, before I forget every reason I have for keeping this civil." The two men stared at each other for a long, charged moment, the surrounding club oblivious to the violence humming just beneath the surface of the exchange. Then Marco laughed, low and unbothered, and inclined his head toward Grace with mocking politeness. "A pleasure, Grace. I hope Salvatore's as good to you as he pretends to be." He turned and walked away, his men falling into step behind him, leaving a silence in his wake that felt, to Salvatore, louder than any shout. Grace was staring at him, her earlier ease entirely gone, replaced by something wary and searching. What was that? Nothing you need to worry about. Salvatore? Her voice was sharp now, cutting through his attempted deflection. That man just implied you had someone killed. In front of me, and you're telling me not to worry about it. Salvatore sat back down heavily, running a hand over his face, feeling the careful architecture of the evening, of the entire relationship, really, beginning to buckle under a weight he'd known, distantly, was always coming. Marco Castellano is a rival. My family and his have been at war, in various forms, for longer than either of us has been alive. He says things to provoke reactions. Some of what he implies is true. Some of it is theatre. Which part was true? He didn't answer immediately, and the silence stretched long enough that Grace's expression shifted from wariness into something closer to fear. Not of him, he realized with a lurch of his stomach, but for herself, for what she might be sitting across from. "I've done things in my life that I can't undo," he said finally, quiet and stripped of any performance. "I told you that, the day I gave you the coat, the day I told you I fund the clinic. I meant it then and I mean it now. I'm not going to lie to you about the shape of what I am, Grace. But I will tell you this." He reached across the table, careful not to touch her without permission, waiting until she nodded slightly, before closing his hand gently over hers. "Nothing that man threatens will ever touch you. I would burn down everything I've built before I let that happen."
Grace pulled her hand back slowly, not in rejection exactly, but in the careful, deliberate way of someone needing space to think. "I need to go home." He didn't argue. He drove her home in silence, the green dress and the crystal chandeliers and Marco Castellano's cold smile hanging over the car like smoke. And when they reached her building, she paused at the door of the car, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. "I'm not running," she said quietly. "I want you to know that. I'm scared, and I have questions I don't know if I'm ready for the answers to. But I'm not running. I just need tonight to think."
She disappeared into the building before he could respond, and Salvatore sat in the car for a long time afterward, staring up at her dark window, understanding with brutal clarity that Marco Castellano had just handed him the single greatest weakness of his entire life on a silver platter. The knowledge that Salvatore Moretti had finally found something he could be threatened with. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat on her small balcony, wrapped in the charcoal coat Salvatore had bought her weeks earlier, watching the city lights blur and refocus through eyes too tired for tears, turning over everything she knew and everything she'd carefully avoided knowing about the man who had, in the space of a month, become the centre of a life she'd spent years deliberately keeping small and safe. She thought about her mother, dying slowly in a hospital bed because the family couldn't afford treatment fast enough. About the particular fury that had shaped Grace's entire adult life. The fury of watching a system fail someone she loved and deciding, with the stubbornness of grief, to spend her career being the exception to that failure. She had built herself around the principle that people deserved help without conditions, without a ledger of debts and repayments. Salvatore Moretti's entire world ran on exactly that ledger. Debts, repayments, violence as currency, loyalty measured in blood. Marco Castellano's cold implication. Ask his last associate, "Oh wait, you can't," replayed in her mind on a brutal loop, and she found she could not simply dismiss it as theatre, not entirely. Not when she'd seen with her own eyes the way Salvatore's whole body had transformed in that moment. The coldness that had moved behind his eyes, like something ancient and dangerous finally surfacing. And yet, she thought of the man who had sat in her waiting room for 40 minutes without complaint, who had told her the truth about his father, about loneliness, about the particular ache of building a life where no one could get close enough to hurt him, who had funded her clinic anonymously and then told her the truth about it, rather than let a lie sit between them, even a generous one, who had looked at her after Marco's threat and told her without hesitation that he would burn down everything he'd built before letting harm touch her. She didn't know how to reconcile those two men. She wasn't certain, sitting alone on her balcony at 3 a.m, that they were actually two men at all, rather than one man containing multitudes too complicated for easy moral arithmetic. Her phone buzzed. A text from Salvatore sent at 2:47 a.m. "I won't ask you to accept all of it tonight. I only ask that you let me explain when you're ready. Whatever you decide after that, I'll respect it. I just don't want the last thing you know of me to be Marco's version of the truth." Grace stared at the message for a long time before finally typing back, "Come to the clinic tomorrow. Not as a patient. Just come and we'll talk. I want to understand, Salvatore. I'm just not sure understanding will make this easier." "It won't," he replied, with the same brutal honesty that had first drawn her to him in that small exam room a month ago. "But I'd rather you understand and choose to walk away than stay because you didn't know the truth." She read the message 3 times before finally setting the phone aside, and something in his willingness to hand her the exit, to make walking away easier rather than harder, settled a small, stubborn certainty in her chest that she wasn't yet ready to name. He came the next afternoon, after the clinic had closed, finding her alone in the small break room, nursing a cup of tea gone cold. He didn't sit immediately, standing instead near the door with the careful stillness of a man bracing for a verdict. "Tell me everything," Grace said quietly. "Not the parts you think I can handle. Everything, like you promised." So he did. He told her about his father, a man who had built the Moretti Empire on fear and violence, and taught his only son that softness got you killed in their world. He told her about taking over the family business at 26 after his father's death, about the wars he'd fought to hold the territory his father had carved out through violence and threat. He told her, without flinching, about men who had died on his orders, not all of them guilty of anything worse than loyalty to the wrong family, though he did not attempt to soften that fact or dress it in easier language. He told her about Petrosky, the driver who'd sold out the Prescott shipment, whose fate he did not fully detail, but did not deny either. Grace listened without interrupting, her tea going colder, her expressions cycling through horror and something more complicated that Salvatore couldn't fully name. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a kind of clear-eyed reckoning that felt, somehow, more valuable than easy absolution would have been. "Why are you telling me all of this?" she asked finally, when he'd fallen silent. You could have kept lying. I might never have found out the full truth. Because you deserve to make your choice with clean information, Salvatore said. Because a life built on lying to you isn't a life I want, even if it's easier. Even if it costs me the thing I want most in the world. Grace was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her cold tea. I don't know how to be with a man who's done what you've done, she said finally, her voice thick. I've spent my whole life trying to help people who fall through the cracks of a system that doesn't value them enough to save them. And you're telling me you've been the reason some people fell through those cracks permanently. Yes, he didn't flinch from it. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise, or by promising I'll simply stop, because that's not a promise I can honestly make. The business I run doesn't have an exit that doesn't get people I love killed. Then what are we doing, Salvatore? Her voice cracked slightly. What exactly are we building here if you can't change and I can't accept what you are? He crossed the small room slowly, giving her every opportunity to stop him, and knelt beside her chair so they were eye level, close enough that she could see the genuine anguish moving behind his usually guarded expression. I don't know, he admitted. I've never wanted anything enough to ask myself that question before. I only know that when I'm with you, I remember what it felt like to be a person before I became this. And I'm not willing to give that up without trying to find an answer, even if the answer takes time we don't currently have. Grace reached out finally and touched his face, her thumb brushing gently along his jaw, and Salvatore closed his eyes at the contact, like a man finally allowed to breathe after holding it too long. I need time, she said softly. Not to leave, just to sit with this. To figure out how to hold both truths about you at once. Can you give me that? I'd give you anything, he said, and meant it with a completeness that frightened him more than any enemy ever had. 2 weeks passed in a fragile, careful peace. Grace didn't withdraw exactly, but something guarded had entered her manner. Small pauses before she reached for his hand, a new watchfulness in her eyes when he arrived at the clinic that hadn't been there before Marco Castellano's cold smile had cracked open the careful fiction they'd been building together. Salvatore bore it without complaint, understanding it as the price of honesty, grateful in a way that surprised him that she hadn't simply walked away. He threw himself into the quieter mechanics of protecting her instead. The security detail Dominic had arranged, now doubled, still invisible to Grace, but thorough in a way that let Salvatore sleep marginally easier at night. He kept his distance from Velvet, from any venue where Marco Castellano might engineer another confrontation. He funneled resources into ending the war with the Castellanos as quickly and decisively as possible, understanding with brutal clarity that every day the conflict dragged on was another day Grace remained a potential target. It was Dominic who brought him the news that shattered the fragile peace entirely. Boss. Dominic's expression when he entered Salvatore's office carried a gravity that made Salvatore set down the contract he'd been reviewing immediately. It's the clinic. Salvatore's whole body went cold. What happened? Is Grace, she's fine. It's not that kind of trouble. Dominic dropped a folder on the desk. Halloran Development filed an emergency variance request with the city yesterday. Different angle than the original zoning proposal. They're arguing the building's a fire code violation, unsafe for continued occupancy. If the city inspector agrees, they can force an immediate closure pending renovations that Halloran's conveniently offering to fund, in exchange for a 99-year lease on the property once it's renovated. Salvatore opened the folder, scanning the documents with rapidly building fury. This is Whitmore. He's found a way around my instruction without technically breaking it. Worse than that, boss. Dominic's voice was grim. The inspector's already scheduled a site visit for Friday. Word is he's been paid to find whatever violations he needs to find, regardless of what's actually there. This isn't a real fire code issue. It's a manufactured one, built to force the clinic out inside a week. Salvatore closed the folder, his jaw tight, his mind already racing through the mechanics of the threat. An inspector who could be bought back, a Halloran executive who needed to understand the cost of crossing him, a councilman who apparently required a considerably harder lesson than the one Salvatore had already delivered. This was, he understood immediately, exactly the kind of crisis that would require him to use every dirty tool in his considerable arsenal, the very tools he had spent the last month trying to keep separate from the fragile, careful thing he was building with Grace. "Get me everything on this inspector," he said. "Family, debts, weaknesses. And get me a meeting with whoever's actually running Halloran Development, not Whitmore's contact, the real decision-maker. I want to understand exactly who I'm dealing with before Friday. And if the inspector can't be turned?" Salvatore's expression hardened into something Dominic had seen many times over 15 years. The particular coldness that meant negotiation had ended and something more permanent was about to begin. "Then we find someone who can be. There is no version of Friday where that clinic closes, Dominic, whatever it costs." He didn't tell Grace immediately. He told himself it was to protect her from worry before he'd confirmed the full shape of the threat. But some quieter, more honest part of him understood that he was also protecting the fragile progress they'd made over the last 2 weeks. The careful rebuilding of trust that a crisis this large might shatter entirely, especially if she learned that solving it would require him to use exactly the kind of dirty leverage that had frightened her in the first place. He worked through the night instead, alone in his office, tracing the threads of Halloran Development's finances, cross-referencing the inspector's known associates and debts, building the careful architecture of pressure he would need to bring the entire scheme crashing down before Friday's site visit could do irreparable damage. It was nearly 4 in the morning when his phone buzzed. Grace, unable to sleep the way she often was these last 2 weeks. "Can't sleep, thinking about you. Everything okay?" He stared at the message for a long moment, weighing honesty against protection, and finally typed, "There's something happening with the clinic, something serious. I need you to trust me for the next few days, even if you don't like the methods I use to fix it." The reply came slower this time, more careful. "What kind of serious?" "The kind where I need to be exactly who I am to fix it," he wrote back. "No half measures this time, Grace. I need you to be ready for that." There was a long pause before her response finally arrived, and when it did, it carried a weight and a courage that made something in Salvatore's chest ache with a tenderness he barely recognized in himself. "Then be who you are. Fix it. I trust you, Salvatore. I just need you to come back to me after and tell me everything, the way you promised." "I will," he promised, and set down the phone and turned back to the documents spread across his desk with a renewed, ferocious focus, understanding that the coming days would test not just his considerable power, but the entire fragile architecture of trust he and Grace had spent a month carefully building between 2 worlds that were never supposed to touch. The real decision-maker at Halloran Development turned out to be a man named Victor Reyes, a silver-haired executive with the polished manner of someone who'd spent 30 years learning exactly how far he could push before consequences arrived, and had rarely, if ever, encountered a man capable of pushing back with equal force. He agreed to meet Salvatore at a private club downtown, clearly expecting the meeting to unfold as most of his negotiations did, a veiled threat here, a generous incentive there, a conclusion that left Reyes with slightly more than he'd started with, and his opponent slightly less. He was, Salvatore noted within the first 2 minutes of conversation, entirely unprepared for the alternative. Mr. Moretti. Reyes extended a hand with practiced warmth. I understand you have some interest in the Carver Street parcel. I'll admit I wasn't aware the Moretti family had moved into real estate. We haven't, Salvatore said, ignoring the offered hand, settling into the seat across from Reyes with unhurried authority. I'm here about the fire code inspection you've arranged for Friday. I want it cancelled. Reyes's smile flickered, then reasserted itself, though something more careful had entered his eyes. I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to. Any inspection scheduled by the city is entirely the city's business, not mine. Let's not waste each other's time, Victor. Salvatore's voice remained perfectly level, which somehow made the words more menacing than any raised voice could have managed. I know about the inspector's payment, routed through a shell account traced back to a Halloran subsidiary. I know about the 99-year lease agreement Whitmore's office has already drafted, contingent on the clinic's forced relocation. I know your firm's put down deposits with 3 contractors expecting groundbreaking within the year. I know, in short, everything about this scheme, down to the dollar. Reyes's careful composure cracked slightly, the first real flicker of alarm entering his expression. That's a significant amount of information for a man with no legitimate connection to this development. I don't need a legitimate connection. I need this scheme to end. Salvatore leaned forward slightly. Here's what happens next, Victor. You're going to instruct your inspector to find the building compliant, effective immediately. You're going to release Councilman Whitmore from whatever arrangement pressured him into supporting your original zoning proposal, and you're going to quietly abandon any future interest in the Carver Street parcel, permanently. And why? Reyes said, some of his earlier confidence returning, apparently deciding to test the boundaries of the threat. Would I do any of that? You have no legal standing here, Mr. Moretti. Whatever information you have on my company's arrangements, I have equal information about yours. We could both make things very uncomfortable for each other. It was, Salvatore reflected, exactly the mistake he'd expected Reyes to make. The assumption of parity between 2 dangerous men, when in fact the 2 men in question were dangerous in entirely different registers. Reyes played the long game of leveraged information and legal maneuvering. Salvatore played a game with considerably higher stakes and considerably fewer rules. Let me be very clear about the difference between us, Salvatore said quietly, and something in his tone made even Reyes's practiced composure falter. You threaten me with lawyers and information leaks. I could, if I chose, ensure your company never secures another permit in this city for the rest of your natural life. And your natural life, Victor, is a variable I have considerably more control over than you currently understand. I am not interested in a prolonged negotiation. I am interested in you making the correct decision quickly so that we never need to have this conversation again. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Reyes's hand, resting on the table, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. This is remarkably invested interest for a man with no stake in a charity clinic. That's the last question you get to ask me, Victor. My reasons are not your business. My patience, however brief it remains, absolutely is. Salvatore rose, buttoning his coat with the same unhurried precision he brought to every gesture. Friday's inspection will find the building fully compliant. I'll be watching to confirm it. If it doesn't, if there's any further attempt to threaten that property, direct or otherwise, you'll discover exactly how invested I am, in ways that will not involve lawyers or leaked information at all. He left, without waiting for a response, understanding from the ashen quality of Reyes's expression that the message had landed with the full weight he'd intended. It was, by the standards of his usual business, a relatively bloodless resolution. No violence, no bodies, simply the careful application of fear precisely calibrated to produce compliance. But as he settled into his car and directed his driver toward the clinic, he found himself troubled by the same instinct that had unsettled him weeks earlier in Whitmore's office. A sense that Reyes, humiliated and cornered, might not simply accept defeat gracefully. Men like Victor Reyes did not build real estate empires by absorbing losses without eventually seeking some form of retaliation, however delayed, however indirect. He filed the concern away, understanding it as a problem for another day, and allowed himself, for the length of the drive, to simply anticipate seeing Grace, to imagine the relief on her face when he told her the immediate crisis had passed, not yet understanding that Victor Reyes, humiliated in that private club, would spend the following week not accepting defeat at all, but rather searching, with the particular patience of wounded pride, for a weapon capable of striking back at Salvatore Moretti through the one vulnerability the entire city now knew he possessed. Friday arrived cold and clear, and Grace spent the morning unable to focus on anything beyond the clock, watching the minutes crawl toward the 10 o'clock inspection with a knot of anxiety lodged permanently beneath her ribs. She hadn't told the rest of the clinic staff the full shape of what was happening, only that there was a fire code inspection scheduled, that the stakes were higher than usual, that they should present the building in its best possible light. She hadn't told them about Salvatore either, about the quiet, terrifying scope of what he'd apparently done in the days since their 4 a.m. text exchange, about the way he'd promised to be exactly who he was, to fix this, and had, evidently, kept that promise in ways she still didn't fully understand. The inspector arrived at 10 sharp. A thin, nervous man named Delgado, who moved through the building with a clipboard and a manner that suggested he would rather be anywhere else on Earth. He checked the wiring, the fire extinguishers, the emergency exits, the smoke detectors, working through his list with mechanical efficiency, occasionally glancing toward the door as though expecting someone to arrive and change the terms of his visit at any moment. "Everything checks out," he said finally, nearly 40 minutes later, his relief audible even through the professional flatness of his tone. "Building's fully compliant. I'll file my report by end of day." Grace exhaled a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a week. "Thank you. Truly." Delgado paused at the door, glancing back at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something between fear and reluctant respect. "You should know," he said quietly. "I came here today with different instructions. Very different. Somebody made it worth my while to change my mind." He didn't elaborate further, simply nodded once and left, And Grace stood alone in the small waiting room, understanding, with a clarity that made her knees weak, exactly what kind of pressure it had taken to produce that particular change of heart. Salvatore arrived an hour later, finding her in the break room again, the same spot where she'd asked him 2 weeks earlier to tell her everything. "It's done," he said simply, before she could ask. The inspection passed. Whitmore's released from whatever arrangement pressured him into the original zoning proposal. Halloran's abandoned interest in the parcel. The clinic isn't going anywhere. Grace crossed the room and, without hesitation, wrapped her arms around him, burying her face against his chest in a gesture of relief so unguarded that Salvatore felt something in his chest crack open entirely. He held her carefully, one hand coming up to cradle the back of her head, understanding that this moment, her trust, freely given despite everything she now knew about him, was worth more than anything he'd built in 20 years of careful, calculated power. "Thank you," she said, muffled against his shirt. "I know what that probably cost. I know what it probably meant, the way you had to fix this. And I'm choosing not to ask for every detail, because some part of me understands that I don't actually want to know all of it. But thank you." "I told you I'd give you anything," he said quietly, resting his chin against the top of her head. "I meant it." She pulled back slightly to look up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something else, a fierce, complicated tenderness that hadn't been there before Marco Castellano's cold smile had cracked open their careful fiction, something that had been rebuilt, stronger and more honest in the 2 weeks since. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you asked me, about what we're building here. I don't have a full answer yet. I still don't know how to reconcile every part of what you are. But I know I don't want to lose this, whatever this is." "Then don't," Salvatore said simply. "Stay. Let me keep showing up, all of it, exactly as I promised. And I'll spend whatever time it takes proving to you that the man who protects this clinic and the man who loves you aren't separate from each other. They're the same man." The word hung in the air between them. Loves. The first time either of them had said it aloud, and Grace's breath caught audibly. "You love me?" "I've loved you since you looked at a stranger's bullet wound and asked for nothing but his name," Salvatore said, and the raw honesty in his voice, stripped of every calculated performance he usually wore like armor, undid something in Grace that she'd been carefully guarding for a month. "I love you too," she said, quiet and certain, and kissed him before either of them could complicate the moment with further words, and for a while, in the small break room of a clinic that had nearly been stolen from her by men with far less honest intentions than the dangerous one currently holding her like something precious, Grace allowed herself to simply believe that the hardest part of their story had already passed. She was wrong, though neither of them would understand exactly how wrong for another 11 days, when Victor Reyes's wounded pride finally found its weapon and aimed it directly at the one place Salvatore Moretti had never quite finished fortifying. 11 days of fragile happiness followed, the kind Salvatore had never allowed himself to believe he deserved. Evenings spent at Grace's apartment, cooking meals neither of them were particularly skilled at making. Mornings where he lingered longer than his schedule ever technically allowed. Quiet hours where the weight of his other life receded just far enough to let him remember, however briefly, what it felt like to simply be a man in love rather than a man at war. He should have known better than to trust the quiet. It was a Tuesday, ordinary and unremarkable, when the man walked into the Sacred Heart Clinic just past noon, moving through the waiting room with a slow, deliberate calm that made the hair on the back of Grace's neck rise before she'd even consciously registered why. He was unremarkable in appearance, mid-30s, plain clothes, nothing about him that should have triggered alarm in a room full of ordinary patients waiting for ordinary care. But Grace had spent 6 years learning to read rooms, to notice the small signals of distress and danger long before they fully announced themselves. And something about this man's stillness, the way his eyes moved across the room cataloguing exits rather than searching for a place to sit, sent a current of fear straight through her. "Can I help you?" she asked, approaching him with the careful, professional warmth she brought to every patient, though every instinct in her body was screaming a warning she couldn't yet name. "I'm looking for Grace Whitfield," the man said, his voice pleasant, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. "That's me." He smiled, and something in the smile finally confirmed every alarm bell in her head. "Victor Reyes sends his regards," he said quietly, close enough now that only she could hear him. "He wanted me to deliver a message. Tell Salvatore Moretti that some debts don't stay settled just because he thinks they do. Tell him the clinic he's so invested in protecting is only as safe as the woman standing in it." Grace's blood went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do." The man's smile never wavered, pleasant and terrible in equal measure. "You're smart, Grace. I can see it in your eyes. You already understand exactly what kind of message this is." He glanced around the crowded waiting room, at the elderly patients and coughing children, entirely oblivious to the danger standing among them. It would be a shame if something happened to a place like this. All these people depending on it, all because a man got too comfortable thinking his enemies would simply forgive being humiliated. "You need to leave," Grace said, her voice shaking despite her best effort at composure, one hand already reaching for the phone in her pocket. "I'm going," the man said easily, already turning toward the door. "I got what I came for. Just make sure Salvatore hears the message clearly, Grace. Victor Reyes doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive, and now he knows exactly where to find the thing Salvatore Moretti actually cares about." He walked out into the grey afternoon with the same unhurried calm he'd arrived with, and Grace stood frozen in the middle of the waiting room, her hands trembling, for nearly a full minute before she managed to move at all. She called Salvatore with shaking hands, and he arrived within 11 minutes, having apparently broken every traffic law in the city to reach her, his face carrying an expression she'd never seen from him before. Not the cold, controlled fury she'd witnessed with Marco Castellano, but something rawer, something closer to genuine terror. "Are you hurt?" He gripped her shoulders, scanning her with frantic intensity, checking for injuries that didn't exist. "Grace, are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she managed. "He didn't touch me, he just—" Her voice broke slightly. "He knew my name, Salvatore. He knew exactly who I was, exactly where to find me, and he threatened this entire clinic just to send you a message." Salvatore pulled her against his chest, and Grace felt him trembling too, felt the full weight of a fear he rarely, if ever, allowed himself to show. "This is my fault," he said, his voice rough. "I pushed Reyes too hard, too publicly. I should have anticipated he'd look for exactly this kind of retaliation. I put you in danger, and I swore to you I never would. You didn't know. I should have known." He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face with a desperate gentleness that contradicted the violence she knew he was capable of. "I need you to listen to me, Grace. I'm going to end this completely, permanently, so there's never another Marco Castellano, another Victor Reyes, another man who thinks he can threaten you to reach me. But it means I need to do things in the next few days that will not be gentle, that might frighten you more than anything you've learned about me so far." Grace held his gaze, and despite the fear still coursing through her, despite the trembling in her own hands, she found a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. "Do it," she said. "Whatever it takes, Salvatore. I'm not asking you to be gentle anymore. I'm asking you to keep these people safe. All of them. Whatever that requires." Something shifted in his expression, resolve hardening into something absolute, something that Grace understood in that moment was the true face of Salvatore Moretti, the version his enemies feared and his allies depended upon, finally being given full permission to emerge without apology. "Then it ends this week," he said quietly. "I promise you that." Salvatore didn't sleep that night or the next. He convened his full command structure in the penthouse's war room, a space Grace had never seen, wouldn't see for months yet. Walls lined with maps and surveillance photographs, the machinery of an empire built on violence, laid bare without pretense. Victor Reyes made a mistake, he told the assembled men, his voice carrying the particular coldness that meant every person in the room understood exactly how seriously to take what followed. "He threatened someone under my protection. That mistake ends tonight, permanently, and I want every person connected to that threat to understand precisely why crossing me carries a cost they cannot survive." Dominic laid out what they'd learned in the hours since Grace's call. The man who'd delivered the threat, identified through security footage as a freelance enforcer named Costa, hired through an intermediary that traced back, after considerable pressure applied to several increasingly frightened middlemen, directly to Victor Reyes's personal accounts. Reyes had not used Halloran's corporate structure this time, understanding correctly that his previous scheme's exposure meant any official channel would be traced immediately. He'd gone private, personal, desperate. The mark of a man who'd staked his pride on retaliation, regardless of the risk. "He's holed up at his lake house," Dominic reported. "Security detail of 4, nothing we can't handle. Costa's already been located too, separate location, easier target." "Costa first," Salvatore said. "I want him to understand in detail exactly what happens to men who threaten people under my protection. Then I want him to deliver a message to whoever else Reyes might think to hire in the future, that this well is permanently poisoned. No one touches anyone connected to me again, for any price." The night that followed was one Salvatore would never describe to Grace in full detail, understanding correctly that some truths, however honestly offered, served no purpose beyond wounding the person forced to hear them. He would tell her eventually only the barest outline, that Costa would not be threatening anyone again, that the message had been delivered with a thoroughness that ensured it would never need repeating. Victor Reyes proved a more complicated problem, precisely because Salvatore understood that killing a prominent real estate executive, however privately satisfying, would draw exactly the kind of public attention and police scrutiny he'd spent the earlier confrontation carefully avoiding. Reyes required a different kind of ending, one that destroyed him just as completely, without leaving a body for anyone to find. Salvatore visited him personally 2 nights later at the lake house Dominic had identified, his security detail neutralized with a professional efficiency that left every man alive but thoroughly educated about the wisdom of continued employment with Victor Reyes. Reyes was waiting in his study when Salvatore entered, unarmed, his earlier bravado entirely evaporated, replaced by the particular pale terror of a man who finally understood the true scale of what he'd provoked.
"I made a mistake," Reyes said immediately, his voice shaking. "Sending someone to that clinic, threatening the woman, that was a mistake, Salvatore. I lost my temper after our meeting, and You threatened someone I love," Salvatore said quietly, settling into the chair across from Reyes's desk with the same unhurried calm he'd brought to their first meeting, though everything about the current encounter carried a weight the earlier one hadn't. "There is no version of an apology that resolves that, Victor. There is only what happens next." Reyes's hands trembled visibly. "Please, I have a family. I know exactly what you have," Salvatore interrupted. "I know your net worth, your debts, your mistress in the Hamptons your wife doesn't know about, the offshore accounts your accountant thinks are hidden from federal auditors. I know everything about you, Victor, and I'm choosing, out of whatever mercy I have left, not to kill you tonight." Reyes's breath caught, hope flickering dangerously in his frightened eyes. "But your company is finished," Salvatore continued, his voice never rising, never wavering. "By this time next month, every bank that's ever extended Halloran Development credit will call in their loans simultaneously. Every permit you're currently pursuing across this city will be denied. Every business relationship you've spent 30 years building will discover, through channels I control, exactly the kind of man you actually are. The kind who threatens nurses and charity clinics to satisfy wounded pride. You will lose everything, Victor. Slowly, publicly, in a way that leaves you alive to fully experience the loss as a permanent reminder of the cost of crossing me." He rose, buttoning his coat, leaving Reyes shaking in his chair, and paused at the study door. "You'll never come near that clinic, or that woman, or anything connected to me, ever again. If you do, if I ever hear your name in connection with either of them, even in passing, the mercy I'm extending tonight expires permanently. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Reyes whispered. "God, yes, I understand." Salvatore left without another word, and within 6 weeks, precisely as promised, Victor Reyes's empire crumbled with a completeness that made the local business papers speculate about mismanagement and market conditions, never once suspecting the true architecture of his downfall. Halloran Development ceased to exist within the year. Victor Reyes retreated from public life entirely, his reputation and fortune both destroyed, alive but permanently, thoroughly ruined. It was, by the standards of Salvatore's world, an act of remarkable restraint. He returned to his penthouse that night with blood on no one's hands, but a war nonetheless decisively ended, and found Grace waiting for him, having let herself in with the key he'd given her the week before, curled on his couch in the dark, unable to sleep until she knew he'd returned safely. "Is it over?" she asked quietly when he sat down beside her. "It's over," he confirmed. "No one will ever threaten you again, Grace. I promise you that with absolute certainty." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she didn't quite name, and then reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his with a tenderness that told him, more clearly than any words could have, that whatever darkness he'd carried through that night,
had not, finally, cost him the thing he valued most. "Then come to bed," she said softly. "You look like you haven't slept in days." He hadn't, and for the first time in nearly a week, held against her in the quiet dark of his penthouse, Salvatore Moretti finally allowed himself to rest. Peace, when it finally arrived, felt almost foreign to both of them. Winter settled fully over the city, and with Marco Castellano's aggression cooled by a fragile truce Salvatore had negotiated in the weeks following Reyes's downfall,
And Victor Reyes himself, erased entirely from any position of power, Salvatore found himself, for the first time in years, without an immediate war demanding his full attention. He used the unfamiliar quiet to do something he'd never once considered doing for any woman before. He began, carefully and deliberately, to build her a place in his actual life, not just the careful, compartmentalized corner he'd initially tried to keep separate from his business. He brought her to family dinners with his cousins, who studied her with open curiosity and, gradually, warm approval. He introduced her to Dominic properly, watching with quiet satisfaction as his oldest friend's initial wariness melted, within a few shared dinners, into genuine affection. He took her to the harbour at sunset, showed her the ships that carried his family's fortune, told her stories about his childhood that he'd never shared with anyone. Not out of calculated honesty this time, but out of simple, uncomplicated trust. Grace, in turn, began to fold him into her own life with the same deliberate care. She brought him to the clinic's small holiday party, watched him charm elderly patients with a warmth she suspected few people beyond herself ever glimpsed. She introduced him to her closest friend from nursing school, who pulled Grace aside afterward to whisper, with barely restrained delight, that she'd never seen Grace look so thoroughly, unguardedly happy. It was, by any measure, exactly the kind of life neither of them had believed themselves capable of building. Salvatore too hardened by 2 decades of violence to trust softness. Grace too wary of losing herself to a man whose world contradicted everything she'd built her career around protecting. And yet, 3 months into their relationship, on a Sunday morning heavy with new snow, Salvatore knelt in the middle of his penthouse's wraparound terrace, cities spread out gleaming and white beneath them, and asked Grace Whitfield to marry him. She said yes before he'd even finished the question, laughing and crying in equal measure, and for a while, wrapped together against the cold with a ring catching the winter light between them, both of them allowed themselves to believe that the hardest chapters of their story had permanently closed. They were wrong, though the danger that finally arrived came from a direction neither of them had thought to guard against. It was Dominic who brought the news, 3 weeks after the engagement, his expression carrying a gravity that immediately cut through the celebratory mood still lingering in Salvatore's penthouse. "Boss, we have a problem, and it's not Castellano, and it's not anything connected to Reyes." Dominic's voice was careful, measured, the tone he used when delivering news he knew would land badly. "It's federal. RICO investigation, 3 years in the making, apparently. They've been building a case against the whole organization, financial records, wiretaps, at least 2 informants we haven't identified yet. My contact inside the DA's office says indictments could come down within the month." Salvatore's whole body went still. "How bad?"
Bad, boss. They've got financial trails connecting to the shipping business, to Velvet, to at least 4 properties we thought were clean. And Dominic hesitated, glancing toward the hallway where Grace could be heard humming faintly in the kitchen, unaware of the conversation unfolding in the next room. They've got surveillance photos of you and Grace, multiple locations, multiple dates. If this goes to trial, boss, she's not just a footnote. The prosecution's going to paint her as evidence of your lifestyle, maybe even try to compel her testimony about what she knows regarding your business. Salvatore closed his eyes briefly, feeling the fragile architecture of the peace they'd built over the last 3 months threaten to collapse entirely beneath a danger that had nothing to do with rival families or corrupt developers, and everything to do with the simple, brutal fact that Salvatore Moretti's entire life remained, no matter how carefully he tried to protect the people he loved, built on a foundation the law had been patiently working to dismantle for years. "Does she know anything that could actually hurt me in a courtroom?" he asked quietly. "No," Dominic said immediately. "You've kept her clean, boss, deliberately. She doesn't know operational details, doesn't know about Petrovsky, doesn't know about half of what happened with Reyes beyond the broad strokes. But that won't stop a prosecutor from trying to use her anyway, to pressure you, to pressure her, to build a narrative for a jury about the kind of man you are." Salvatore sat with the weight of it for a long moment, understanding that this danger, unlike Marco Castellano or Victor Reyes, could not be resolved through fear, through violence, through the careful application of power that had solved every previous threat in his life. This danger required something he had far less practice deploying: patience, legal strategy, and the terrible possibility that no amount of power might be enough to fully protect Grace from the consequences of loving him. "Get me our lawyers," he said finally. "Tonight. I want to understand exactly what they have and exactly what our options are before I say a single word to Grace about any of this." But even as he said it, some quieter, more honest part of him understood that keeping this from her, even briefly, even out of protection, carried its own dangerous cost. A cost he would discover within days was considerably higher than he'd anticipated. The federal investigation moved with a speed that caught even Salvatore's considerable resources off guard. Within a week of Dominic's warning, 2 of his lawyers confirmed the worst of it: a sealed indictment already prepared, awaiting only the final coordination of a multi-agency raid that could come at any moment, potentially within days. He kept the details from Grace for exactly 4 days, telling himself each morning that he needed 1 more day to understand the shape of the threat before burdening her with it. Understanding, with the particular dishonesty of a man protecting someone he loved, that each day of silence was itself becoming a kind of lie. She found out from a source he hadn't anticipated at all. "Salvatore?" Grace's voice, when she called him on a Thursday afternoon, carried a controlled fury he'd never heard from her before. "A woman came to the clinic today, said she was a federal prosecutor. She had photographs, Salvatore, of us, at the harbour, at the restaurant, at family dinners with your cousins. She wanted to know what I knew about your business. She implied that if I didn't cooperate, I could be charged as an accessory to obstruction just for staying with you after learning what you do." Salvatore's blood ran cold. "Grace, I was going to tell you." "When?" Her voice cracked. "When were you going to tell me that federal agents have been watching us for months, Salvatore? That there's an indictment coming that could put you in prison for the rest of your life, and could apparently drag me down with you. I had to hear it from a stranger holding surveillance photos of our engagement dinner. I was trying to protect you by lying to me. The words landed like a blow, and Salvatore felt the full weight of the mistake settle over him with brutal clarity. You promised me, Salvatore. In that break room, the day I asked you to tell me everything, you promised no more lies, even the generous ones, even the protective ones. And you kept that promise for months. And now, the moment things got dangerous in a way you couldn't control with money or violence, you went right back to deciding what I could and couldn't handle knowing.
You're right, Salvatore said quietly, the admission costing him more than almost anything he'd ever said aloud. I was wrong to keep this from you. I was scared, Grace, genuinely scared in a way none of the other threats ever made me, because this one I can't simply solve with power or fear. This one might actually take me from you, permanently. And I didn't know how to tell you that without watching you decide it wasn't worth the risk of staying. Grace was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened slightly, though the hurt remained clear beneath it. That wasn't your decision to make for me, Salvatore. I've made every choice about staying with you with open eyes from the very beginning. I deserve the chance to make this choice the same way. You're right, he said again. Come to the penthouse, tonight. I'll tell you everything, the full scope of the investigation, everything my lawyers know, everything that could happen in the coming weeks. No more protecting you from truths that are actually yours to carry too. She came that evening, and Salvatore laid out the full shape of the crisis without a single detail softened or withheld. The sealed indictment, the multi-agency coordination suggesting an imminent raid, the very real possibility of decades in federal prison, the danger that Grace herself might be compelled to testify, or even, in the prosecution's more aggressive scenarios, face charges of her own for her continued relationship with him after learning the truth of his business. Grace listened in silence, her face pale but composed, and when he finished, she sat with the weight of it for a long moment, before finally speaking. What do your lawyers think your odds are, if this goes to trial? Not good, Salvatore admitted. The financial trail is extensive. 2 informants, possibly more. If the evidence is as strong as my lawyers believe, we're looking at a plea negotiation at best. Significant prison time regardless of the outcome, though possibly reduced from what a full conviction would carry. And me? What happens to me in all of this? My lawyers believe they can shield you from direct charges, Salvatore said carefully. You have no operational knowledge of the business, no financial ties to any of the accounts under investigation. But they can't guarantee you won't be compelled to testify, won't be dragged through months of scrutiny and public exposure, regardless of the outcome. Grace, I need you to understand. Staying with me through this could cost you everything you've built. Your reputation, possibly your license, certainly your privacy and peace for years to come. Grace was quiet for a long time, staring at the ring on her finger, turning it slowly the way she turned water glasses when she was thinking hard about something. Is there a version of this, she said finally, where you walk away from it? Not from me, from the business, from everything that's brought this kind of danger into both our lives. Salvatore had asked himself the same question countless times over the preceding 4 days, turning it over with the same careful precision he applied to every threat. And the answer he'd arrived at was neither simple nor entirely comforting.
There might be, he said slowly. My lawyers have floated the possibility of full cooperation, providing evidence against certain associates, certain operations, in exchange for a reduced sentence and eventual release. It would mean testifying against people I've called family for 20 years. It would mean becoming, in the eyes of everyone I've ever known in this life, the worst kind of traitor. But it might also mean an actual future grace, a version of this where I eventually walk out of prison instead of dying in it, where we might actually get to build the life we've been imagining.
Would you do that? Grace asked quietly. Could you actually do that, after everything you've told me about loyalty, about what your father taught you? Salvatore reached for her hand, holding it with a gentleness that contradicted every violent instinct he'd spent 20 years cultivating. For you, he said, with a certainty that surprised even himself, I think I could do almost anything. I think I've been waiting my whole life for a reason large enough to justify walking away from everything my father built. And I didn't know I'd found it until this exact moment. Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she leaned into him, resting her forehead against his shoulder. And we figure this out together, she said. Whatever it takes. No more secrets, Salvatore. Not from here on. No more secrets, he agreed, and held her against the mounting darkness of a future neither of them could fully predict, understanding that the coming weeks would test everything they'd built together far more thoroughly than any rival family or corrupt developer ever had. The identity of the second informant arrived like a blow neither of them had prepared for. Dominic delivered the news 3 days later, his face ashen in a way Salvatore had rarely seen in 15 years of partnership. Boss, I need you to sit down for this. Just tell me. It's Enzo. Dominic's voice cracked slightly on the name. Enzo, who'd bled out against a stack of crates on the Prescott docks and survived, who'd sworn loyalty with his own blood staining Salvatore's sleeve that night, who Salvatore had personally ensured received the best medical care his organization could arrange. He's been cooperating with the feds for over a year, since before the Prescott hit, actually. Turns out the attack that night wasn't just Castellano's doing. Enzo tipped them off too. Been feeding federal agents information the whole time in exchange for immunity. Salvatore sat perfectly still, processing a betrayal that cut deeper than any bullet wound, deeper than Marco Castellano's cold threats or Victor Reyes's desperate retaliation, because this betrayal came from inside the family itself, from a man Salvatore had personally saved. Why? He asked finally, his voice carrying a rawness he rarely allowed anyone to witness. Gambling debts, apparently. Debts to people who weren't as patient as we are. The feds offered him a way out, and he took it. Dominic's expression carried a complicated grief of his own, the particular pain of losing faith in a man he'd fought alongside for years. He's been wearing a wire for the last 4 months, boss. Every conversation, every meeting he's been present for, including conversations about Grace, Salvatore finished quietly, understanding with dawning horror exactly how thoroughly compromised his careful protection of her had actually been, including the security detail arrangements, her routine, her building. We're already changing everything, Dominic said quickly. New security team, entirely different rotation, nothing Enzo would have had access to. But boss, he hesitated. The federal case against you is stronger than we thought. If Enzo's been recording for 4 months, they don't just have financial trails anymore. They have your voice, ordering things, discussing operations. This isn't a case built on inference anymore, it's direct evidence. Salvatore absorbed the news with the particular stillness that meant, to anyone who knew him well, that he was containing something far more volatile than his composed exterior suggested. 20 years of careful empire building, and it would come apart not through the violence of a rival family, not through the corrupt scheming of a developer with wounded pride, but through the quiet betrayal of a man he'd trusted, whose life he'd personally saved. "Where is he now?" Salvatore asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Federal Protective Custody, boss. We can't touch him. And honestly," Dominic met his eyes with unusual directness, "I don't think you should try. Not with the case already this strong. Anything happens to Enzo now, it just confirms every allegation the prosecution's already building. It makes things worse, not better." Salvatore knew Dominic was right, understood it with the same cold rationality he brought to every strategic decision, and hated the knowledge with an intensity that made his hands clench into fists at his sides. 20 years ago, his father would have found a way to reach Enzo regardless of federal protection, would have made an example so absolute it would have deterred any future betrayal for a generation. Salvatore found himself, for the first time in years, genuinely uncertain whether restraint or violence represented the correct path forward. He thought of Grace, of the promise he'd made her only days earlier, no more secrets, figuring this out together, whatever it takes. He thought of the future he'd imagined on his terrace 3 weeks earlier, kneeling in the snow with a ring in his hand, believing, foolishly perhaps, that love might be strong enough to outrun the consequences of the life he'd built. "Get the lawyers back here," Salvatore said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. "If the case is this strong, we need to seriously discuss cooperation. Not as a last resort anymore, Dominic, as the only realistic path forward." Dominic's expression shifted, surprise and something like grief moving behind his usually composed features. "You're actually considering it? Testifying against the family?" "I'm considering surviving," Salvatore said quietly. "I'm considering a version of my life where I actually get to grow old with the woman I love, instead of dying in prison or dying in some retaliatory war that never actually ends, generation after generation, the way my father's war never ended, the way it would have consumed me too if I'd never walked into that clinic and met someone who showed me there was another way to exist in the world." Dominic was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried an unexpected gentleness. "For what it's worth, boss, I've followed you for 15 years because I believed you were building something better than your father built. Maybe this is what better actually looks like. Not more power, more territory, more fear, just an actual life at the end of it." Salvatore looked at his oldest friend, understanding the risk Dominic himself faced in whatever cooperation eventually unfolded. The loyalty that had cost him 2 fingers and years of his life, now potentially unraveling into something neither of them could fully predict. "You don't have to follow me into this, Dom. Whatever happens with my case, you have options I don't." "I know," Dominic said simply. "I'm following you anyway. Let's go talk to the lawyers." The federal agents came at dawn, 11 days after Dominic's revelation about Enzo, while Salvatore and Grace slept tangled together in the penthouse's bedroom, the city outside still dark and quiet beneath a fresh dusting of late winter snow. The sound of the door breaking woke them both simultaneously, Salvatore's body reacting with the trained instinct of a man who had lived his entire life anticipating exactly this kind of violent intrusion, already moving to shield Grace before his conscious mind had fully processed what was happening. "FBI! Hands where we can see them!" The bedroom flooded with tactical lights and shouting agents, and Grace, disoriented and terrified, felt Salvatore's arm come around her protectively, even as he raised his other hand slowly, calling out in a voice carefully controlled despite the chaos. "We're unarmed. My fiancée has no knowledge of anything relevant to this investigation. Please, be careful with her." The next several hours passed in a blur that Grace would struggle to fully piece together afterward. Being separated from Salvatore despite his protests, questioned in a sterile room downtown by agents who asked pointed questions about what she knew, what she'd witnessed, whether she'd ever handled money or documents connected to the Moretti organization. She answered honestly, exactly as Salvatore had coached her lawyers to advise, understanding that honesty, in this particular crisis, represented her only genuine protection. She wasn't charged. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Alvarez, who reminded Grace uncomfortably of herself in her more relentless moods, made clear during the questioning that the government's primary interest remained Salvatore, not the nurse, who'd apparently known nothing of operational details and possessed no financial ties to any of the investigation's evidence trail. But Salvatore was arrested. Grace learned this from Dominic, who met her outside the federal building hours later, his face carrying the same grim composure he'd worn the night he'd delivered news of Enzo's betrayal. "He's being processed now," Dominic told her. "Arraignment scheduled for tomorrow morning. The lawyers are already working on it, Grace, but I won't lie to you. This is exactly as bad as we feared. Multiple counts, racketeering, conspiracy, enough evidence between the financial trail and Enzo's recordings to make this an extremely difficult case to fight." "Can I see him?" "Not tonight. Maybe tomorrow, after arraignment, if bail's granted." Dominic's expression softened slightly, an unusual gentleness from a man Grace had initially found intimidating in every possible way. "For what it's worth, he asked about you before they took him in. Made sure I understood that protecting you came before anything else, including his own case." "That's the kind of man he actually is, Grace, whatever the prosecution's about to paint him as in that courtroom." Grace spent that night alone in the penthouse, for the first time since their engagement, unable to sleep, wandering through rooms that still carried Salvatore's presence in every carefully chosen detail. The terrace where he'd proposed, the kitchen where they'd cooked their first disastrous meal together, the bedroom where federal agents had, hours earlier, torn apart the fragile piece they'd spent months carefully constructing. She thought about her mother, about the particular grief of loving someone the world had already decided wasn't worth saving. She thought about every patient she'd ever treated, who'd fallen through cracks a system had built specifically to exclude them. She thought about Salvatore's face, the raw honesty in his voice when he'd told her only weeks earlier that he thought he could do almost anything for her, that he'd been waiting his whole life for a reason large enough to walk away from everything his father built. She made a decision that night, alone in the quiet dark, that would ultimately reshape everything that followed. The arraignment the next morning was a media circus, reporters crowding the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as Salvatore appeared in handcuffs, his expression carefully composed despite the chaos, searching the gallery until his eyes found Grace sitting in the third row,
and something in his shoulders visibly relaxed at the sight of her.
Bail was denied. The prosecution successfully argued flight risk, given the scope of Salvatore's resources and international connections, and Grace watched, her heart breaking, as he was led back toward federal custody without the chance for even a brief embrace. But as the guards moved him past the gallery, he paused just long enough to meet her eyes directly, and mouthed 3 words that carried across the crowded courtroom despite the surrounding chaos. "I love you." Grace mouthed them back, tears finally spilling over despite her best effort at composure, and understood, watching him disappear through the courtroom's side door, that whatever came next, however this case eventually resolved, however many years it might take, however much of the life they'd imagined together might be delayed or diminished by the consequences of choices Salvatore had made long before she'd ever walked into his life, she was not going to let him face it alone. She left the courthouse and drove directly to the offices of Alvarez, the lead prosecutor, understanding exactly what she intended to do, and exactly what it might cost her. "I want to talk to you about cooperation," Grace said, sitting across from Alvarez's desk with a composure she didn't entirely feel, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Not mine. I've told you everything I know, which is nothing useful. I want to talk about Salvatore's." Alvarez studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant respect moving behind her sharp, assessing eyes. "His lawyers have already approached us about a cooperation agreement. It's being negotiated." "I know. I want to understand what it actually looks like, what it would take for him to have an actual future at the end of this, instead of just decades disappearing into a system that doesn't care whether he ever gets the chance to build something different." "Ms. Whitfield," Alvarez's voice carried a careful neutrality. "I appreciate that you love him. I even understand it, to whatever extent an outsider can understand these things. But I need you to understand something too. The man you love has ordered violence against people, has built an empire on exactly the kind of exploitation and fear that destroys communities like the one you've spent your career trying to help. Full cooperation doesn't erase that. It might reduce his sentence. It won't make him innocent." "I know that," Grace said quietly. "I've known that since the day I asked him to tell me everything. And he did, without a single detail softened to make it easier for me to hear. I'm not asking you to pretend he's innocent, Ms. Alvarez. I'm asking you to understand that people can actually change, if they're given a real chance to. I've watched him change these past months. I've watched a man who built his entire identity around never needing anyone choose over and over to be vulnerable with me instead. I've watched him protect a free clinic that gives him absolutely nothing in return, purely because he decided it deserved to exist. That's not nothing. That has to count for something in whatever calculation you're making about what kind of future he deserves. Alvarez was quiet for a long moment, turning a pen slowly between her fingers, and when she finally spoke, her voice had softened slightly. Full cooperation would mean testifying against several key figures in his organization. It would mean providing evidence that will end careers, end lives, possibly get him killed by people who consider that kind of betrayal unforgivable, even from behind prison walls. Are you prepared for that possibility, Ms. Whitfield? That the price of a reduced sentence might ultimately be his life, paid a different way? Grace absorbed the warning with a steadiness that surprised even her. I've thought about that. I've thought about very little else since yesterday morning. But I'd rather love a man who chose to fight for an actual future, even a dangerous one, than watch him simply accept decades of imprisonment as a foregone conclusion. Protecting people who've spent years building an empire on exactly the kind of harm I've dedicated my entire career to healing. And if he says no? If loyalty to his organization outweighs whatever future you're both imagining? Grace's expression flickered with a vulnerability she hadn't intended to show. Then I'll love him anyway, whatever that looks like, wherever it happens. But I don't think that's who he is anymore, Ms. Alvarez. I think the man who proposed to me on his terrace in the snow, who told me he'd been waiting his whole life for a reason large enough to walk away from his father's legacy, I think that man already made his choice. He's just waiting for the chance to prove it. She was allowed to visit him 3 days later, in a small, sterile room with a guard stationed at the door, glass separating them in a way that made Grace's chest ache with a physical intensity she hadn't anticipated. Salvatore looked different in the orange jumpsuit, smaller somehow, though she understood it was an illusion, that the man behind the glass remained exactly as formidable as the one who'd knelt in the snow with a ring in his hand. "You shouldn't have come," he said, though his eyes betrayed how badly he'd needed to see her. "I went to see Alvarez," Grace said without preamble. "I told her about the man I've watched you become these past months. I told her I believed full cooperation was the right choice, whatever it costs." Salvatore was quiet for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his tired eyes. "Dominic told me the terms my lawyers are negotiating. Full testimony against the organization, against people I've known my entire life, in exchange for a reduced sentence, potentially as little as 8 years with good behavior. It would mean becoming, in the eyes of everyone I've ever called family, the worst kind of traitor imaginable. And in exchange? An actual future," he admitted quietly. "A chance to walk out of prison while I'm still young enough to build something new. A chance to actually marry you, Grace, instead of asking you to wait for a man who might die behind bars before he ever gets the opportunity." "Then do it," Grace said, pressing her palm flat against the glass separating them, and Salvatore mirrored the gesture on his side, their hands aligned but unable to actually touch, the barrier between them a physical manifestation of everything still standing between the life they'd imagined and the one currently unfolding. "Whatever it costs you, Salvatore. Whatever it costs both of us. I'd rather have 8 years of waiting for an actual future than a lifetime of visiting you through glass, watching you slowly disappear into a system that never intended to let you leave." "They might come after you," he said quietly. "Once word gets out that I'm cooperating, the organization won't simply accept it. There will be people who want to punish you for my choice, the same way Marco Castellano wanted to punish me by threatening you." "I've thought about that too," Grace said, her voice steady despite the fear underneath it. "Dominic's already arranging protection, isn't he? He told me, before I came here today, said you'd asked him to handle it, regardless of what you eventually decided." Something in Salvatore's expression cracked slightly, a vulnerability he rarely allowed even Grace to witness fully. "I would burn down every remaining piece of the empire my father built before I let anything happen to you. I told you that months ago, and it's only become truer since." "Then choose the future," Grace said softly. "Choose us. I'm not asking you to become someone else entirely, Salvatore. I'm asking you to become the man I already believe you are, underneath everything your father taught you. The one who protects a free clinic because it deserves to exist. the one who told a nurse the truth about loneliness on their very first dinner, when every instinct he'd spent 20 years cultivating should have told him to lie. Salvatore held her gaze through the glass for a long, charged moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a certainty that settled something anxious in Grace's chest that had been coiled tight since the moment federal agents had broken down their bedroom door. "I'll do it," he said. "Full cooperation, whatever it takes to eventually build the future we've been imagining, even if it takes years to get there." 8 years, as it turned out, became 6, reduced further by the extraordinary value of Salvatore's testimony, evidence so thorough and so damaging that it dismantled not just the Moretti organization's remaining operations, but 2 other criminal enterprises entangled with it, including, in a piece of justice Grace found particularly satisfying, the remnants of what Marco Castellano had once controlled, dismantled through a parallel investigation that Salvatore's cooperation had helped accelerate considerably. Dominic served 18 months on lesser charges, protected by his own limited cooperation and the simple fact that his loyalty, in the end, had been directed toward building something better rather than merely accumulating power. He visited the clinic regularly during Salvatore's imprisonment, an unlikely presence among the volunteers and patients, gradually becoming, in his own gruff way, part of the extended family Grace had built around Sacred Heart. The clinic itself thrived in the years that followed, its funding secured not through anonymous shell companies anymore, but through a proper foundation established in Salvatore's name, funded by the legitimate assets the government allowed him to retain after the extensive forfeitures required by his plea agreement. Enough to ensure Sacred Heart Community Clinic would never again face the threat of closure, expanded eventually into a full community health center, serving 3 times the patients it once had, with Grace promoted to director within 2 years, overseeing its growth with the same fierce, unguarded compassion that had first drawn Salvatore through its doors on a rainy Tuesday morning years earlier. Grace visited him every week without fail, through 6 years of a relationship conducted largely through glass and monitored phone calls and increasingly rare, precious contact visits earned through good behavior and the particular respect Salvatore commanded even within prison walls, where his transformation from feared crime boss to cooperating witness had initially made him a target, until his willingness to protect vulnerable inmates from the kind of predation his old organization once profited from earned him, gradually, a different kind of reputation entirely. They married in the prison's small visitation room during his 4th year, a ceremony neither elaborate nor traditional. Grace in a simple white dress, Salvatore in the cleanest version of his prison uniform he could manage, Dominic standing witness alongside a clinic volunteer Grace had grown close to during the long years of waiting. It was, by any conventional measure, nothing like the wedding either of them might have once imagined. No penthouse terrace, no crystal chandeliers, none of the luxurious excess that had once defined Salvatore's world. It was, Grace would tell anyone who asked in the years that followed, the happiest day of her life, regardless. He was released on a bright October morning, 6 years and 2 months after federal agents had broken down their bedroom door, Grace waiting outside the prison gates with a bouquet of white roses and an expression that combined relief and joy in equal, overwhelming measure. Salvatore walked through the gates a changed man in every visible way. Leaner, quieter, carrying himself with none of the predatory confidence that had once defined every room he entered, replaced instead by something steadier, more deliberate.
A man who had spent 6 years learning to be exactly the person he wanted to become, rather than the one his father's legacy had demanded of him. "You came," he said, though he'd known she would, though she'd never once missed a visit in 6 years, never once given him reason to doubt the fierce, stubborn loyalty that had first captured his attention in a small exam room years earlier.
"I told you I wasn't running," Grace said, closing the distance between them and wrapping her arms around him with a completeness that made Salvatore's carefully maintained composure finally crack entirely. 6 years of restrained emotion breaking loose in the bright autumn sunlight outside a prison that no longer held any claim over either of their futures. "I meant it then. I mean it now." They built a life together in the years that followed, quieter and smaller than anything Salvatore had once imagined for himself, but richer, he would tell Grace often, than anything his father's empire had ever provided. He worked alongside her at the clinic, initially in modest administrative roles that gradually expanded as the community came to trust the transformed version of the man they'd once feared. Eventually taking charge of the Foundation's operations entirely, ensuring Sacred Heart's continued growth with the same rigorous discipline he'd once applied to considerably darker enterprises. They had a daughter, 3 years after his release, a girl with Grace's warm brown eyes and Salvatore's fierce, protective intensity, who grew up understanding her father's complicated history only gradually, in pieces appropriate to her age, learning eventually the full truth of both the darkness he'd once embodied and the light he'd fought so hard to become worthy of. On quiet evenings, sitting on the balcony of the modest house they'd built together, nothing like the penthouse that had once defined Salvatore's world, but entirely, completely theirs, Grace would sometimes ask him if he missed it. The power, the fear his name once commanded, the luxurious excess of a life built on violence and control. "No," he told her, every time with the same absolute certainty. "I spent 20 years believing that world was the only thing capable of making me safe. It took a nurse with an ink-stained wrist, asking nothing of a bleeding stranger except his name, to show me I had it backward the entire time." Safety was never about power, Grace. It was always about this, about you. And Grace, who had spent her entire career believing that compassion offered freely, without conditions, without a ledger of debts and repayments, could change the small corner of the world she dedicated herself to healing, understood finally that she had changed something far larger than she'd ever imagined possible. Not just a struggling clinic on the East Side, not just the patients who continued year after year to receive care without a price tag attached to their worth, but a man who had believed for 20 years that love was a weakness his world couldn't afford. She had proven, in the end, that he'd been wrong about that too. The clinic's small plaque, mounted near its entrance where every patient passed on their way in, read simply, "Sacred Heart Community Clinic, founded on the belief that everyone deserves care, regardless of what they can offer in return." Beneath it, added years later, a smaller inscription that only Grace and Salvatore fully understood the depth of. For Grace, who taught a dangerous man that the truest power was never about what you could take, it was always about what you were willing to give.